So our first presentation is going to be given to us on a perspective on leadership for a new decade. And as Pat has said, Spencer Stuart is one of our important sponsors here today, and its global lead in leadership advisory services is going to make this first presentation for us. So would you please welcome Patrick Hynes.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Pat, and it's great to be here with my Merck colleagues. Interesting times, I can say, as an Irishman living in London. Any diversion from Brexit is a good thing, even if it's somewhat complex. Here to talk about leadership, and I guess whether you're in business, politics, trade, regulation, leadership is always critical. This was a book that was recommended a year ago by one of my colleagues, and it's an interesting look back at leadership through the ages, from leaders in the American Civil War, Coco Chanel, Walt Disney. The thing that struck me was more something that was in the introduction about the fact that we don't really understand what leadership consists of, and we don't have a model for leadership. And this is a guy who wrote a book a few years ago called Team of Teams. It's a very powerful book. He's ex-US military. And he spent 4 years researching the book, and his conclusion was effectively, we don't really understand leadership. And The Economist had an article over the weekend about the CEO of the future, and one line struck me. It said, "No topic has attracted more voodoo analysis than leadership." So it would appear that leadership is still an emerging topic. It's certainly not an exact science. We've been around for 56 years. We help big organizations in their leadership decisions, so helping boards choose CEOs and help the CEOs then be successful. So certainly not going to claim to crack the code of leadership, but we've had a backstage pass at a lot of leadership movies, and just wanted to share a few themes from what we've seen over the years. So this is a piece of research that we did that appeared in HBR, Harvard Business Review, in November, and it was trying to assess the performance of CEOs over the life cycle of their tenure. And if you ask people, what do you think that looks like without showing them the graph, most of them say, well, there's a period of a couple of years of ramp up, and then they're at peak performance, and then after 5 or 6 years, they or the boards decide it's time for a refresh, and then they disappear. And actually, if you look at the average tenure of a CEO, it's coming down, and it's typically around 6 years. If you look at the data itself, it's quite interesting. It suggests that it's less clear. There are periods of frankly underperformance, and some interesting observation about some of the best performances come quite late in the life cycle. In a way, the data is one thing. I think the most interesting thing was going out and talking to these CEOs and saying, how did it feel early on? What were the pivotal moments? What were the influencing moments? And a few themes that I will pull out. A lot of them will admit that at some point just gaining the confidence and the credibility to go after some of the big issues doesn't come automatically. For them, getting the CEO role was certainly the starting line, not the finishing line. And for them to have that inner confidence to go after some of the things they wanted to go after can sometimes be 2 or 3 years later. And often those big things are some of the deeper things like corporate culture, things that are hard to actually go after. But I think one great insight is that the best leaders seem to have an inflection point when they realize it's not about themselves, it's about what they help others do. And we use this term sometimes as a force multiplier. They create the conditions for others to succeed. And one of the things that's most important is actually them getting out of their own way, suppressing their own ego, realizing, they spent their life trying to prove how good they are to get to the CEO role, but actually that can get in their way of being successful. And maybe another theme is just this whole concept of renewal. It can be lonely and tough as a CEO. We're in a 24/7 environment, and the fact that they have to find some way to stay resilient, to stay renewed. Some of them will do that physically. Some of them will find, learning opportunities to do it. It's interesting, we have a share in a company called G100, which is a networking organization in the US, and it's all the great and the good, the top CEOs. And in an event just a few weeks ago, we asked for a show of hands as to how many people of the CEOs have coaches, and it was about 85%. And in a way, what the coaches are bringing to them is simply a quiet time, a reflection time, because they find it so hard to get that during the normal sort of course of their careers. So as I say, the key thing is that leaders create the conditions for success. Among the most important ones would be so a very simple framework to think about leadership. It's what we call clarity, alignment, and energy. You can apply this to any company, any business unit, any function. And clarity is just around being, articulating what you stand for, what success looks like, and what your strategy is going to be. It's a very interesting exercise to go to an executive committee of any company or any body and just ask them to articulate the strategy or what success looks like. Individually, just go around and put that together. And it's quite amazing sometimes the variation that you'll get between them. And if you think about it, if that's not, if that's only 70% clear at the executive committee level, by the time you get to the next level, the signal to noise ratio gets very sort of diluted. So if you're not clear about that, then everything else may struggle. Alignment is really saying, okay, given we know where we want to go, where do we put our resources? And, critically, that's around talent and it's around money. There's this concept, Sandy Ogg, who was the previous CHRO of Unilever, who went into Blackstone, the private equity firm, and he pushes really hard on talent for value. He says, there's always 3 or 4 critical roles, and if you don't have A-star players in those roles, you will struggle. So it's getting the top team, it's getting the right people, and it's actually putting your resources, as I say, where you're putting your money where your mouth is. It's amazing. Some organizations will say, we have a digital strategy, this is what we want to do, and if you look at the management bandwidth and the money they put in it, it's just a complete disconnect. The third one is around energy, and it's around inspiring people in the organization to go the extra mile, to be intellectually, emotionally bought in. There's a word cloud of an organization. We sometimes will walk in and see word clouds that have very different and more negative phrases on them. And if you've got 2 organizations with the same strategy and same resources, and on the one side you have an employee base that is fully engaged and motivated and one that's just going through the motions, this is going to outperform the other one every day. It's a very simple model. Interestingly, the one that, first of all, I'll say, the world, you could argue this model could be valid 100 years ago, and it was. What's changing is just the complexity of the situation. The external world is changing so quickly that the ability to keep up with what's going on out there and adjust at the right pace is a real key skill. You can't change your strategy and your org structure every 3 months because that would just lead to chaos. But it is something that if you think you have a strategy and you just focus on it, you risk being left behind. As one CEO said, when you think you're done, you're done. So the ability to keep in touch with what's happening and adjusting as you go along is a critical skill. The other thing that has changed is around employees. Probably, but 20, 30 years ago, the social contract was you went to work because you appreciated having a job and to get paid. And nowadays, that's very different. People want something very different from a job. They want a sense of purpose, a sense of identity. And if they don't get that, they will go somewhere else. Simple model. Interestingly, the one that CEOs struggle with, and they're very often frustrated with the pace of change, it's the middle one. It's actually aligning the resources. They kind of often, and they can get external help with this, working out where they want to go, and the strategy is something they can get fairly clear. the energy and the motivation, a lot of them get that, and some are better than others. But it's often that middle bit. How do I really align my people, my team, my resources to drive the organization to where I want to go to? That's where a lot of them will admit that they struggle the most. So CEOs, when you talk to them, though, the word frustration comes up when you say, what's your plan? Where are you going? They can articulate that. When you say, how do you feel about progress? They, their shoulders will drop and they'll just say, God, it's hard work. It feels like you're always into a headwind. And we think there are two things that sort of get in the way. This is a bit of a busy slide, but it starts thinking about leadership more as a system and thinks about individuals, teams, and organizations. And as we say, a great leader these days has to be so much more than a great individual. And it just makes the point that the things that really matter and the things that make the difference are generally beneath the surface. They're sometimes the less obvious factors. So when we look at individuals and CEOs or any other leaders, and when they fail, it's rare that it's to do with their sector experience or their capabilities. It's all to do with their intrinsics. For us, we think a thing about called capacity, which is really your ability to continue to learn. It's critical and conceptual thinking. It's self-awareness. It's humility. It's authenticity. And these are the things that tend to make a difference. On the team side, there's a question that I always ask any CEO or board member or executive committee member. I say, give me a score out of 10 as to how well your executive team is working today. 10 is a super high-performing team. 1 is some Machiavellian, dysfunctional team, and a 5 is a collection of well-intentioned individuals who come together, do their stuff, and then go off into the night. And I don't think I've ever got a score higher than a 6, and the average is probably about a 4 or 5. And when you get into that, it's rare around the mandate of the team or the composition or the agenda. It's the stuff beneath the surface. It's the trust and the sense of vulnerability and the shared objectives. I don't want to quote an ex-English rugby captain here in Dublin, but I will, because he does some work with teams, and he said, what happens is that the teams, they never have the conversation they need to have in the room together. They have it in the corridors and in the rooms, and that's just a basis for mistrust and just not reaping the full potential of a team. And then on the right-hand side, a lot of CEOs are, they're well-schooled, they've been at MBA schools, they love strategy, they love process, they love structure. The things that really matter are probably things around culture and engagement. One of my favorite studies around this is from Duke University, and they just literally went out to all the Fortune 100 CEOs and said, here's a list of 20 things, just tell us the things that drive value creation. And the one that came top of the list was culture. And yet when you go to organizations and say, so given that, I imagine you're taking culture very seriously, and you are measuring it properly and trying to shape it, and you'd be very surprised how few really do that well. Interesting, compare two organizations, GE and Microsoft. They both had peaks in their share price in 1999, both changes of CEOs. GE has never recovered above that share price level in 21 years. They were one of the biggest clients of a management consulting firm, so they spent a fortune on, or they didn't lack for great strategic thinking or what they needed to do, if you like, above the surface. If you look at what Satya Nadella has done at Microsoft, it's all around culture, purpose, empathy. A great quote of his that I like is, and by the way, if there's one book to read, I think Hit Refresh is his sort of autobiography. It's a great read, where he said, business success is simply a function or a lagging indicator of having the right culture. So I would say, two observations. One is that what matters is beneath the surface, and the second would be you need to think about leadership as a system rather than just thinking about individual bits. So maybe three messages to leave with. One is the leader of today has to be so much more than a great individual. It has to be this force multiplier. And if there's one thing that helps with that, it is getting your ego out of the way, because it's never a helpful factor. The second is culture. It matters, and yet it's a hard subject and a squishy subject to get your head around, but the great organizations do that and often lead with culture. And the last point is more around the HR function and CHROs, who are critical if leadership is to be as powerful as it can be. And I think it's an interesting observation that in most organizations, the CFO sits on the board and the CHRO rarely does. And I think that has to change and will change. Good. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you for that, Patrick. Some very interesting observations there for us to think about.